If you've followed my channel for a while, you'll know defence procurement doesn't always deliver the quickest or cheapest results. Sometimes a military might receive world-beating systems on time, under budget, and in quantity. But on other occasions, delivery timelines will be pushed back, performance characteristics might be revised downwards, all the while the sticker shock only heads in one direction, often leaving the public to read reports on an overly expensive, underperforming, or barely existent system, cough cough T14, cough cough, and ask how on earth things came to that. Sometimes, as we've talked about before, the answer might be corruption, that magical, almost alchemical process that converts munitions into mansions. On other occasions, it's simply the result of people getting it wrong. There's an old saying that you should never ascribe to malice that which could be adequately explained by incompetence. And from poorly controlled scope creep to gold plating, I've talked about some of this before as well. But I'd almost argue that given the stunning complexity of some defence development and procurement projects, that it often doesn't take incompetence for things to go spinning off the rails. Instead, it takes incredibly tight planning and excellent execution to make sure that it doesn't. And here's the kicker that I wanted to explore today. And that's that sometimes things like high prices or odd procurement decisions might not be the result of mistakes or anything nefarious at all, but instead, strange as it might seem, simply be a result of the system working as designed. For example, in the past we know that certain governments have deliberately overinflated the price of certain defence programs. Not so much to cover the yacht fees of anyone involved, although I'm sure that has happened, but instead to provide budgetary cover for funds that are secretly being diverted towards classified programs. During the Cold War, for example, the US probably wasn't keen to include a specific budget line labelled Covert Submarine Operations, Soviets please don't read. But on other occasions, these decisions might simply be the result of the incentives faced by every member of the defence procurement ecosystem. While the troops probably want the best equipment possible and the public would probably prefer it didn't cost them their universal healthcare, the actual decision makers in the system are often going to face their own family of incentives. Whether it be politicians looking out for the interests of their local constituents, planners trying to maintain the health of the overall defence industrial base and control consolidation, or private firms trying to maximise profit in a sometimes interesting competitive environment, it's those incentives that are often going to shape the results that are achieved, even if those results aren't always the cheapest possible in the short term. So I hope you're ready for another discussion of how defence procurement can go wrong, this time without anything actually going wrong. Okay, so what am I going to be talking about today? We'll start with some basics. We'll start with incentives, how they operate, and how in an idealised world governments might go about getting the best possible value for money in their military procurement. Then we'll start going over reasons why in the real world that doesn't always mean the best possible product at the cheapest possible price. We'll cover interests and incentives around industry, competition and consolidation, why the incentive in defence procurement negotiations can operate a little bit differently from the ordinary market, before jumping into the fun world of political incentives and what that means for program selection and also supply chain design, because sometimes building cheaply isn't politically desirable. Then to tie it all together, we'll go back to the land of Emutopia with a hypothetical example, walking through how these incentives can operate together to send procurement processes in weird and wonderful directions. But given the topic, I think I need to add some caveats up front. After all, we're here to learn, laugh and occasionally cry over the wonderful world of defence economics, not to audit anyone's practices or programs. There will be caveats on this page and in the description, and to that I'll add a specific reminder that this isn't financial advice. Not just because you probably shouldn't be getting investment advice from YouTube, but also because, like any reasonable Australian, I would rather have to deal with a Spetsnaz kill team than with ASIC. So let me throw these caveats up front. Firstly, I'm trying to illustrate broad concepts here, and I've tried to lift this up to as high a level as possible. That means every concept, every example is going to have its exceptions. Different countries organise their systems in different ways, and a phenomenon that is applicable and present in one context may not be present in another. To keep things clear, I'm going to try and stick to historical and hypothetical examples where I can. Any apparent resemblance or similarity to contemporary events, individuals, organisations, etc. is purely coincidental. Alright, so let's start with the basics. Incentives. In the context of this video, what I mean by incentive is pretty simple. An incentive is anything that motivates you to do or not do something or act in a particular way. Often, they're going to be built around either reward or punishment, and they can occur at every level of an organisation. Everyone from the Commander-in-Chief or CEO all the way down to fresh-faced cadets or interns, all are ultimately going to answer to their own family of incentives. The important thing here is that incentives do not have to be well connected to your mission or your purpose as an individual or as an organisation. If I'm a construction firm and say my mission and your purpose should be to build the best quality homes for young families, but also the only people in the organisation that get promoted are those who are able to find creative ways to cut costs, well, then the incentive isn't to build really nice homes now, is it? But instead to figure out what the weight-bearing capacity of balsa wood and egg cartons is, and whether with a thick enough layer of paint, a couple of nails and some duct tape, the whole thing will hold together long enough for you to get paid. Identifying incentives doesn't have to be simple, but there are some questions you can ask if you're trying to locate them. If you ask questions like, what are people paid to do? What are people punished for doing or not doing? Or what gets people promoted? Then you're probably on the right track. Screw up your incentives and you can break things pretty quickly. If you only pay loan officers based on how much money they lend out, for example, with no check or balance against writing bad debt, and unless they have strong moral fibre, they're going to respond by lending the kid running the lemonade stand $3 million, leaving you with a very expensive inevitable default further down the line, when the kid's parents calmly explain to you that his pocket money will not in fact cover the minimum repayments. Now, an incentive may not work on 100% of people or in 100% of cases, and in any given organisational context, you're going to have people who ignore that sort of pressure. But through processes of filtering and selection, over time, you can see communities, organisations, militaries or government begin to filter those individuals out potentially. This sort of attrition and selection process means that over time, an organisation is going to behave more and more in line with the incentives that are in place. And depending on what those incentives are, that may be a good thing, a bad thing, or anything in between. And given these concepts are pretty generally applicable, defence economics is no real exception. If you think about it, defence procurement is a complex system with a variety of actors all responding to their own interests and incentives. And if you're trying to understand defence procurement, then you probably can't go wrong trying to examine the motivations that these different groups might have. Not to engage in corrupt practices or anything self-enriching, but instead the different considerations that their job forces them to take account of. From complex factors like clashing policy concerns, down to relatively simple things like the incentive to minimise excess personal work or to increase personal risk exposure. And we'll start with a brief discussion of how defence procurement might work in a highly idealised world where it operated in a complete vacuum. In this world, there is absolutely no consideration for anyone involved, no other priority than buying the best possible stuff at the best possible price. So we work through the process we've discussed in many episodes before. We look at our strategic environment, we develop a strategic concept, we figure out what it is we need in order to achieve our objectives. Then we probably go out to market and we do a competitive tender. I say I need 1,000 tanks with XYZ requirements, and so firms like KMW or Hyundai Rotem and General Dynamics Land Systems will come forward with their candidates, what they're offering and at what price. We look at the bids that are put forward, decide what meets the specifications and offers the best overall value for money, that is, balancing capability and cost. And then, based on those considerations, we decide if we're going to be Abrams, Leopard, or K2 people going forward. The goal in this ideal state is just to get the warfighter the best possible stuff, while inflicting the least possible damage on the nation's taxpayers. But the real world is seldom going to be that simple. And so there might be reasons for decision makers to want to deviate a little from that basic formulation of how decisions are made, to sacrifice just a little purity of the competition in exchange for something else, including, ironically enough, an attempt to maintain competition in the sector and avoid further consolidation. And if being anti-competitive to maintain competition doesn't make much sense to you, stick with me, I will try and explain the incentive structure. At its most basic, competition is a mechanism for efficiently allocating resources. If you run a firm that's capable of producing better cars at a cheaper price than all of your competitors, then economically speaking, it's more efficient that you should have the labour, the capital and the steel and all the other necessary inputs so that the overall economic benefit is maximised. In its purest form, this is a pretty ruthless Darwinian process. The winner is going to likely be able to raise capital, to expand, to scale up their operations, while the losers are going to need to either innovate, pick up their game and find a way to compete, or die out. Depending on what market you look at, you'll usually find the majority of new small businesses eventually fail. And even of those that succeed, only a small minority eventually expand and make it to the big time. For every entrepreneur that makes it big and goes on YouTube saying that they have found the secret to success and prosperity, before in many cases immediately pivoting to try and sell you a course on how to do the same, there are going to be many, many more stories not told about those who didn't make it. And that harsh competitive logic can also apply to private firms in the defence sector. So the system theoretically works as intended, making winners and losers out of the various bidders, with the winner, at least hypothetically, being the more efficient firm with the better offer. The question is, what do you do if you're a loser in that scenario? Major platform contracting isn't fast fashion. You're not throwing out your F-35s every 6 months and buying something new. And so if you're a firm and you lose out on selection to be, for example, the next fighter aircraft and can't find a foreign contract to compensate, well, suddenly you might be looking at potentially decades of your existing line and infrastructure being underutilised. So what do? You could borrow or use existing capital to try again into more competitions to try and get a contract to reactivate your infrastructure. But among other limitations, you might hit two limits here. Firstly, eventually you're just going to run out of funding. And secondly, with every contract that your opponents win, they're generating credibility, proving that they actually can build what they claim that they can build, that they can deliver on time and to budget, and that they have an up-to-date workforce that's been doing this for the past decade or so. You, by contrast, might be asking the customer to take your abilities at least a little bit on faith, which doesn't make winning impossible, it's just an extra barrier you have to cross. Alternatively, you could try to integrate yourself into a rival supply chain, playing a small part in their larger project. But 1, why would they let you in? 2, if they do let you in, how profitable is it really going to be? And 3, is that really going to stand you in good stead for the next competition? Then there's another option, one which allows you to return some value to your shareholders. You take all or part of your business and you sell it to one of your competitors. You sell that infrastructure that you can't utilise to someone who can use it and profitably so. And so whether caused by failure in competition or just other pressures, so begins consolidation. Now, from a point of view of business incentives, consolidation makes perfect sense. Theoretically, you'd expect there to be a huge number of ways in which a big firm, all else being equal, is better than a small firm. You're just going to be able to bring more resources and economies of scale to face any particular problem. A couple of blokes in a shed might be able to bang out some basic small arms using nothing more than relatively basic tooling. But if you're going to start building nuclear submarines, you're going to need more capital and more scale. Plus, you might be able to take better advantage of vertical integration, spread risk across multiple business units. So maybe if your aircraft line has a slow couple of months, the profits from the missile line will make up for them and allow you to continue business as normal. And all the usual business advantages as well, things as simple as shared services, having a shared HR function, having a shared accounting and legal function. Plus, you've also indirectly reduced your future competition. If you're one of 4 medium firms in the market, but you manage to merge with one of your competitors, well now, instead of competing with 3 peers, you're competing with 2 opponents, both half your size. You can imagine these sort of scenarios popping up time and time again in different markets around the world, and those smaller companies who survive looking at the situation they find themselves in and ultimately deciding that discretion might be a better path to shareholder value creation than valor, and that as a result they too should find their place at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. I need to stress here that this phenomenon is in no way unique to the defence sector. You'll find it everywhere, especially when you're dealing with capital-intensive industries that reward scale in a big way. The automotive industry, for example, has a very large number of recognisable brands, but over the last half-century or more, a lot of them have ended up being owned by each other. The giants of the technology sector have often engaged in mergers and acquisitions, and even massively strategic industries like semiconductor production are often dominated by a few key successful actors. And some of the same factors that help lead to consolidation in those sectors also apply alongside some additional unique ones when you're talking about the defence sector. The late 20th and early 21st century have been an era of tremendous consolidation in the defence sector. Perhaps the most dramatic of these consolidations occurred after the end of the Cold War, where defence decision makers in places like the United States decided there probably weren't going to be enough contracts to go around to maintain the DIB as it was, and so in some cases actively encouraged firms to consolidate to ensure their own survival. And so, according to a February 2022 report in the United States, since the 1990s, the number of US aerospace and defence prime contractors fell by about 90%. The report further claimed that the number of suppliers for tactical missile systems fell from 13 to 3, fixed-wing aircraft from 8 to 3, satellites from 8 to 4, and that now 90% of missile systems came from only 3 sources. In Russia, for example, the United Aircraft Corporation, UAC, has basically succeeded in eating the Russian aerospace sector, while itself being 90-something% owned by Rostec, who have eaten just about everything else. You'll hear about various subsidiary firms like Uralvagonzavod, for example, the tank manufacturer, but again, that firm is 97% plus owned by Rostec. Now, the US, EU and others may not have taken the Russian step of consolidating most of the defence industrial base into a single state-owned megacorporation, but the consolidation has been real, the risk of further consolidation is also real, and if you're a decision maker, that might be a problem. So let's just say you're trying to make a decision on where to award a massive contract. One firm's been having a really good couple of years, comes up with a solid design, the other comes up with an okay design after a couple of rough years. Whoever you give the contract to is going to be really, really happy, but the question is, what happens to the loser? Because in an extreme scenario, the answer might be that if they don't win, they're going to close down or sell up. And either way, that might be a problem for government. Firstly, because you might have an interest in keeping just as much capacity as possible in the system in case of emergency. If you just let half your ammo producers go bust and then suddenly you need a bunch of ammunition, well, the leaders of all those firms who close down are going to tell you that your call really is important to them and that they will be able to help you solve your ammunition problem in 3 to 7 years once they're capable of reaccumulating capital in a workforce. Alternatively, if everyone consolidates, you may end up with a competition problem. You run greater risk of running into a situation where realistically only a handful of firms can provide whatever it is you need, and at that point you become vulnerable not just to a single point of failure should anything happen to that firm, but also a lot of those competitive incentives for firms to bid the best possible product at as low a price as possible might begin to die off. So maybe, if you're government, you decide that it's in your best interest to try and keep all of your producers or most of your producers alive. Maybe you decide to split contracts or award some contracts to firms even if they don't have, strictly speaking, the best of the bids that you saw, because you have an interest in keeping producers busy and profitable, not just in getting the best possible value for money on any particular purchase. This might be part of the reason that Admiral Rickover told a congressional committee back in the 1960s that he sometimes felt that he was on 2 different mailing lists. On one list, the Admiral said you get instructions to be economical, not to waste government funds. On the other, you get instructions to pay higher profits, spend more money than you need to look out for industry because industry is not capable of looking out for itself. The motive for that first mailing list should be pretty obvious. When you're talking about defence spending, you're almost always talking about public money, and when you talk about the priorities that members of the public might have for their money, often it might be things like keeping taxes low or making sure that little Timmy's school books don't refer to the Soviet Union as a going concern. By contrast, there probably won't be many voters that are casting their vote based on which party they believe will better protect the profitability of defence sector contractors. But in some ways, you could argue that second mailing list also exists with the goal of saving money in mind, because it may ultimately prove cheaper for government to try and keep a few extra producers alive and competing in a particular industry, as opposed to saving some dollars now but letting them fall over, consolidate, and then leaving government in a position where there may only be one provider to negotiate with. Now sure, provider B and C might hypothetically not be quite as efficient as provider A, and as a result, going with them and keeping them a game might actually be more expensive than simply going with the first option. But as long as they exist and are competing, they protect the motivation for the provider A's of the world to stay efficient and to continue to innovate, lest they wake up one morning and find that they have slipped down the league table. Now, of course, this sort of approach might raise competitive issues all of its own. Namely, if you're a provider B or C and you know that government is going to protect your profitability almost no matter what, then there's a risk it might actually be you who loses your motivation to innovate and improve. That said, there might still be motivations to be leveraged, including the desire to potentially rise up the league table, maybe to unseat provider A, and also just the understanding that even government industrial policy has its budgetary limits. If you can't get your products or your offering close enough in terms of both quality and price, then industrial or competition policy be damned, we're not buying smoothbore cannons to re-equip the artillery. There are a variety of other models that countries sometimes try and use to overcome this particular problem. One national model, for example, includes a system whereby 2 firms might compete on the design of a particular ship, And then whichever design wins will ultimately be produced by both shipyards. That means a much larger award to whichever party wins for their excellent design work, but ultimately means that both producers get production contracts and as a result can retain their workforce and infrastructure. Japan is also an interesting case where defence production is basically a side hustle for some of the big industrial conglomerates. But given that we've talked about Japan before, I won't dive back into that right now. Instead, I think we've landed and explained the concept here pretty well, so let's move on. Specifically to asking the question, what makes defence so different? After all, governments don't usually jump in to intervene every time a supermarket or restaurant goes bust. Why are questions of competition so important? And why are negotiations a little bit different when you're talking about a defence context? The first is that defence as a policy area is just different from most industries in a number of ways. Firstly, it's considered generally to be pretty essential. So while a government might not be motivated to hop into the market, intervene in order to preserve a nation's access to its best coffee shop, for example, it probably would jump in if there was a question of losing access to power, critical healthcare, or defence capability. Another example is the fact that it's an industry where usually the buyer has a pretty strict rulebook to follow. Until the day F-35s become available for public purchase, most defence procurement is going to be done by governments. And most of those governments are going to have publicly published manuals that basically set out the rules of how they are going to make decisions. Ideally, that would mean that everyone trying to sell defence products to government will know how the process should be run, how a decision should be made, etc. In a sense, it's kind of like playing a game of blackjack where the dealer both hands you a rulebook and tells you his cards before you decide your move. It doesn't automatically mean you're going to win if, for example, he shows an ace-10 straight off the bat, but it does often mean that the incentive to secure value for money will often be balanced against the incentive to keep your job by following the rulebook as closely as possible. It's also a sector where, as we've discussed, you might only have a few, or in extreme cases, only one seller for a particular piece of equipment or system. And if you do find yourself in that position, there's a chance it won't change quickly, because this is also a sector where you're often dealing with very significant barriers to entry, which means once a competitor is lost, it can be hard to build up a new one to replace them. If your local cafe owner decides to go mad with power and start charging $60 for avocado on toast or something, well, sure, they're very welcome to do it. But it's not going to be long before someone leases a nearby building and starts offering the same product for a much more reasonable $45 a serve. But if you have just one prime aerospace contractor, for example, and they're just not delivering the results, well, then it's probably not as simple as starting a new firm, hiring a couple of people, and 6 months later having a functional 5th-generation fighter jet to enter into the market. Governments might have especially strong incentives to protect a national provider or maintain competition, because if they decided to try and create a new one from scratch, it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of cash, and a lot of risk. Now, of course, there will be plenty of opportunities even for small business working on more simple products or in the supply chain for larger ones, but even then, there still might be unique barriers to entry. A firm that wants to deal in defence, for example, might have to comply with certain security requirements, get its staff cleared, apply upgrades to the security on its computer systems, and get across a range of policies and procedures it wouldn't have to deal with if it remained purely in the civilian sector. If you start dealing with hazardous or energetic materials where you didn't before, well, then you're going to have to comply with a raft of additional safety and location requirements, which, to be fair, does make a reassuring degree of sense. You probably don't want people building a high explosives factory next to a middle school, no matter how interesting that would make field trips. But it is a cost potential new entrants have to keep in mind. And then in other cases, you might just be dealing with materials or processes that have unique costs that aren't particularly transferable to the civilian sector. As the State of Competition within the Defence Industrial Base report notes, for example, quote, many DoD programs use materials or have technical needs that require production processes, equipment, facilities, and specifications beyond those of more numerous commercial products, end quote. And unless the market in question is particularly large or high margin, then the cost of building up those sort of capabilities and overcoming those barriers might come into play. The quote I provided was from the section on castings and forged metal products. But some of that same logic is going to apply in other areas of industry as well. I could go on, but hopefully you're getting the impression that in some ways parts of the defence sector are more akin to a strategic industry like semiconductors than they are to other more regular sectors. And having established that, I want to move on to a whole nother set of special incentives that can cause all sorts of weird and wonderful results that have nothing to do with just simply preserving competition, specifically to the fun area of national and local interests. It can be easy to think of states as unthinking strategic decision-making machines. In that way of thinking, defence spending is an unwelcome but almost inevitable cost. It's an unwelcome burden on the economy as a whole that you want to do as little as possible of, while still being able to achieve all of your objectives. But states aren't run by advanced strategic AI. Usually they're run by political parties, politicians, people. And those people may be charged with representing a range of national and local interests. And depending on how your political system is structured, they may be incentivized to think about defence spending in a slightly different way. Namely, as not so much a cost to be borne, but as a prize to be won. That's because in some countries, defence spending can be a major driver of the health of local or even state economies. I mean, if you want to break it down to an overly too basic level, you might want to think of defence spending as a form of economic transfer. Money is raised through taxes or other mechanisms across the whole breadth of a country, but then it's redeployed in the form of spending to wherever that defence spending is concentrated. For example, if a nation raises funds for a massive new warship building program, then on net, all else being equal, you'd expect that to represent a massive wealth transfer from areas that either don't build ships or don't support the shipbuilding sector to those that do. That might take the form of relatively direct benefits where locals get jobs producing the equipment in question, or maybe it's jobs in the supply chain of subcontractors that sit around them, or all the support services, or the property owners that can now rent out accommodation, or the people who run the cafes, who may see more business now that a bunch of cashed up employees are moving into the area. And if you're talking about the defence sector, usually you're not talking about low-paying jobs either. According to the AIA in 2021, the average salary in the US aerospace and defence sector was $106,700 per annum, about 40% above the US average. That's a mean, not a median, so it might be somewhat skewed by the people at the very top, but you can bet that in most countries there's going to be a lot of towns or cities that are perfectly happy for a bunch of high-paying jobs to move into town, essentially bankrolled by other areas of the country. This incentive to keep things as close to home as possible is one of the things that has always posed a challenge to multinational development and procurement programs. These make great sense on the surface from an economic and technical perspective. You can combine resources, technology, potentially create additional scale, and maybe just outright accomplish something that none of the individual nations would have been able to do economically by themselves. But that also means there's going to be an awful lot of money flowing through the program potentially. And where that money flows is potentially going to have impacts on communities or even nations. So people start asking questions like, who is going to build a particular component, and in so doing get paid for it and be able to build up the workforce and infrastructure to do so? Who's going to own any intellectual property that comes out of the process? And whose requirements should the product try to align with most? You might suggest that all the nations involved in a multinational procurement process have an incentive to build a good aircraft or a good tank or whatever the system is. They all benefit if it's effective, affordable, and delivered on time. But they also have an incentive to try and make sure it's designed for their individual bespoke requirements built entirely in their country using entirely other people's money. Because wouldn't that be a bloody awesome arrangement? If you look at the European 6th Generation Fighter Program, FCAS, with cooperation between France, Germany and Spain, many of the delays in the timeline that we have seen, reportedly, are not because those countries don't know how to build an aircraft. It's not because they lack contractors capable of building engines, airframes, electronics or missile systems. Instead, a lot of it has just been because they can't agree on the division of work. Which companies, and by extension, which countries and which communities do the involved work. I'm sure the French would love it if Dassault built the thing and Germany funded it. But that sort of arrangement is unlikely to be acceptable in Berlin or Madrid, and so you try and find a perfect compromise. And in the context of a multinational program, unlike a national one somewhere like the People's Republic of China, there is no final decision maker that can just resolve the argument. You have to agree. The fact these negotiations happen, the fact these concerns exist, isn't a secret. Companies and governments openly comment. There's a news release here by the Spanish prime contractor involved in the program, saying, quote, Spanish industry achieved an equal position in terms of work, quantity and quality, and governance with our French and German partners. This is just essentially part of the process when you're doing an international armaments program. But that doesn't mean it won't potentially introduce new costs into your program. Because at the end of the day, you're partly negotiating on the basis of what is fair, not what is efficient. Now, in the international context, there is a magic word to help deal with this issue, and that magic word is offset. An offset is basically something you can offer to sweeten the deal, so to speak. Maybe you agree to purchase jets from manufacturers in my country, but in exchange, I agree to invest a certain amount of money in production facilities in your country. Maybe you sign up to buy munitions from me for the next 15 years, but in exchange I provide technology transfer, so at the end of that time period, you're better placed to manufacture your own. Offsets can get very weird and very creative, and they are a critical part of helping to land some international arms deals. But they're really only a tool for helping to manage those sort of national incentives and motivations. They don't completely remove them. And even when you're talking about programs that take place within the bounds of an individual country, that doesn't mean those sort of political and economic interests go out the window. Particularly if you're talking about a representative democracy, the people in your government are probably going to be accountable to some group of voters somewhere. And if you're charged with representing a particular group of people, that might impact your view on national defence policy. If you want a brief illustration of this, it might be worth talking about US military bases. After the end of World War II, the USA had more than 5,600 military bases at home and abroad. Initially, a lot of those remained just in case a fight began with the Soviets in the 50s or 60s. But in the 60s and 70s, there was a strong realisation that there were simply too many bases to be efficient. The US military did not need all of them, and a lot of money could be saved if some were shuttered and their functions consolidated. So to save money, the military began to close hundreds of them. Congress presumably saw government funds being saved and did the only thing they could do. They stopped it. Congress passed legislation in 1977 giving Congress much more control and oversight over base closures, which then resulted in basically no bases closing until 1988. So in 1988, you see things move over to the base realignment and closure process, wherein essentially an independent committee went off, developed recommendations on what bases should be closed, and then rather than being able to edit that list, Congress just gets the option to give the whole thing the thumbs up or thumbs down. That process immediately puts 17 major bases up for closure and many others up for realignment. But the bigger question here is, why might nothing have been closed between 1977 and 1988? Part of it might just be the incentives faced by individual politicians. So let's just say for a moment, congratulations, you've been elected to Congress or Parliament or your national representative body and you now represent a seat. Your party was elected on a platform of cutting down government spending, saving wherever they could, and there's a bunch of excitement around the party room because the Defence Department thinks they found a way to make a major saving. They want to close a massive old military base known as Fort Rustmore. Established during the Second World War, Fort Rustmore is full of ageing infrastructure, is massively larger than it needs to be, is probably surplus to requirements, and probably would still be very useful if it wasn't in entirely the wrong part of the country. Everyone seems very excited about this fact, but you personally, you face a problem, because Fort Rustmore is in your seat. Contracts for everything from food to cleaning to security services provide tremendous employment to your local population. Plus the tens of thousands of military personnel who rotate through the fort obligingly often spend their salaries in your local businesses. Without that fort, many of your constituents are going to lose their businesses, their home values, and potentially much more aside. At this point, the incentive structures are going to kick in. If you support that closure, it's probably going to make good sense for the country as a whole, which I'm sure will be great comfort to you when you're trying to campaign for re-election, and your opponents are able to wave your voting record around and point to the local unemployment line. By contrast, if you push as hard as is possible to hold that facility open, and in a system like the US one, which often has very tight margins between parties, even just a few very well-motivated congressmen or senators willing to aggressively wield their votes across multiple issues might be enough to get concessions. Then you might be fortifying your position with your voters. It's not that your constituents don't care about overall governmental efficiency or don't want the government to save money. It's just that they too have very personal incentives and interests much closer to home. The Australian term that comes to mind here is the NIMBY, or not in my backyard. This describes the phenomenon where people might be supportive of a basic principle or idea as long as it doesn't directly impact them or their property value. People might support building new power stations to bring down electricity prices as long as they can't see or hear the thing. And people are probably generally supportive of saving any inefficiencies in the defence budget, as long as those savings don't happen in their proverbial backyard. And so individual politicians can develop very strong incentives to become very invested supporters of particular programs, particular installations, or particular systems. As an example, let me introduce you to America's next generation ICBM, the LGM-35A Sentinel. Now, my video on nuclear modernisation loses every poll it goes into, so we may not see a full video covering the Sentinel in detail for some time. But suffice to say, this system is meant to replace America's old Minuteman III missiles, giving America's ground-based nuclear deterrent its greatest refresh since the end of the Cold War. And as a very expensive program, as you can imagine, the Sentinel has its supporters and its detractors, with some of its most ardent supporters being a group of 6 United States senators known as the ICBM Coalition. Now, this is not some shadowy grouping, they literally have released public white papers. It's a bipartisan group of 6 US senators who strongly advocate for the role of America's ground-based ICBMs, and particularly for the importance of LGM-35A. These 6 senators come from 5 states: Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, and Utah. These are not the only senators that support the ground-based nuclear deterrent, of course. If you look, for example, at the names behind the Sentinel Nuclear Deterrence Act of 2023, which would have essentially granted long-term procurement funding to the Sentinel program, you'll see some other names that aren't formally part of the coalition. That's the signature of the other Utah Senator, Mitt Romney, on that particular bill. So we happen to have a coalition from the states of Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas and Utah who feel very, very strongly about America's ground-based nuclear deterrent. Okay, so let me ask a completely unrelated question. Where are America's ground-based nuclear missiles based? Well, the 90th Missile Wing is based in Wyoming, the 341st in Montana, and the 91st in North Dakota. Well, that's surely an incredible coincidence, even though it makes up most of the states on our list. But surely that doesn't explain why the senators from the great state of Utah would feel so strongly about America's ground-based nuclear deterrent. Although as a completely unrelated piece of trivia, I'll just add here that Utah is where an awful lot of the support work for the Minuteman III missiles and the supporting systems is done. There have been billions of dollars in contracts issued over the last several years to support the Minuteman III capability, and a significant chunk of that ends up in the great state of Utah. Now again, from a certain perspective, this is entirely understandable. You would expect a local representative or a state senator to look out for the interests of their local area or their state, and the program involved here does have clear military logic behind it. This isn't a campaign to get the taxpayers of Texas or California to pay for a mansion for every resident in Montana. It's a campaign to base intercontinental ballistic missiles. And nuclear missile silos don't make fantastic locations for house parties. But the point here is that the incentives that some decision makers face, when it comes to decisions like giving a thumbs up to thumbs down on the budget for a particular program, is often going to be influenced by local and state concerns and not just overarching military efficiency. And once again, depending on the system and the context, hypothetically, this might create a couple of pain points if you're trying to optimize your military spending. The first is that from a purely defense perspective, from a perspective of the uniformed force, you might end up with funding for systems you don't want and limited or no funding for systems you do. Want to reduce your tank force in order to pay for more drones, missiles, or coffee machines for the barracks? Well, then you better hope the nation's primary tank factory is in a swing state. Want to retire an older part of your air fleet that's eating into your maintenance and upkeep budgets? Well, that may be too bad, because the facility that builds and maintains them is in just the right location, is critical to the local community, and as a result has some pretty vehement defenders when it comes to setting budgets. This doesn't mean those tanks or planes are useless, it doesn't mean you can't build a really good force that includes them. It just means that if you're a military going up with your budget request, it just means you may end up with not quite what you asked for. Kinda like asking for the Star Wars trilogy and receiving anything other than the original 3. Pain point 2 is how your production and your supply chain ends up getting designed. Now, with the help of modern tools and modelling, you can get pretty good at designing very efficient, relatively speaking, production and supply chains. You can take into account a range of factors and come up with something which delivers the best possible combination of efficiency and resilience. However, when the focus becomes on where the benefits of that production and supply chain land, as in where the money is spent, where the activity takes place, well, suddenly you may be looking at factors that are disconnected from just trying to build the most efficient supply chain possible. You may be tempted to start spreading things out in order to make sure that the benefits are fairly distributed. But as you potentially, among other things, add distance and reduce scale, you might see your costs increase. The correct configuration, once you take socioeconomic and political factors into account, may well not be the cheapest option available. If you look at something like the F-35 supply chain, for example, it's massive. Even several years ago, the program already had suppliers in 11 different countries around the world. In a scenario like this, some of those contributions will actually add efficiency. If you're taking advantage of unique local advantages, knowledge, skill, or proximity to the person to be supplied, then having a multinational chain can be not just helpful, it can be essential. But you can also run into cases where participating nations say they want to do more of the work. They want to be able to build up local know-how, they want to employ local people, they want to build up local facilities. So even though it might make more sense to consolidate a particular function and do it at scale, you end up distributing things to make the partnership work. The third pain point, which is only relevant in some political systems, relates to how this sort of decision-making can play out, particularly where it's possible for decision-makers to make individual changes to a defence appropriation without changing the whole thing. Let's say you're a National Air Force, for example, and you want to retire a completely hypothetical aircraft. For the sake of argument, we'll call it the Thunder Pig. Using the money you save from retiring the Thunder Pig, you intend to buy something else, something very important. Maybe your next generation fighter, for example. So you put up a budget request which includes both of those provisions and costs a certain amount of money. Then the political decision makers decide there are some really good reasons to retain the Thunder Pig in service and so actively bar you from retiring it when they approve the spending bill. Well, now you may have a problem because unless they also increase the amount to be funded, you're now left having to find savings elsewhere to pay for that next generation investment. And depending on your competing priorities and available resources, that might be eminently doable or grindingly difficult. The final pain point that follows from these sort of political incentives that I wanted to bring up, and it isn't the only one, is more related to business and investment decisions as opposed to government ones. And it has to do with extreme competition between state, cities, or local areas. To illustrate this, just imagine a firm is looking for a new place to set up a production line for just about any piece of military equipment. A jet, a helicopter, a tank. What it is doesn't matter so much as the fact that wherever it goes, jobs, investment, and good economic times are probably going to go with it. So if you run a state, you might really want that facility in your state. You might approach the firm and the firm will say that your location actually isn't the most competitive one. It makes more sense to place it elsewhere, maybe somewhere closer to a coast, somewhere with more established supporting industries, somewhere with a lower cost environment. So you start offering incentives, tax exemptions, special infrastructure that you're going to build at public expense. You might even provide direct financial incentives to encourage that investment. And the idea is you'll get more back out of the process than you put in. $100 million in incentives might convince a firm to come and deliver $1 billion worth of benefit to your state. The problem then happens when the other locations are trying to do the same thing, maybe even the location that they originally would have gone to if they were being maximally efficient. In the end, there's a risk this whole thing becomes a bidding war. And the total cost, including those incentives of whatever is ultimately produced or whatever benefits are ultimately delivered, are severely diluted by all the incentives that had to go into getting them. Suffice to say, this phenomenon isn't unique to the defence sector. The same incentives apply when you're talking about major civilian corporate investments. And so in some cases, you're going to see taxpayers paying up not to make sure something is built, but to control where it's built. The example I have here is back from 2021 when Florida offered Disney incentive payments in tax break form to move approximately 2,000 positions from California to Florida. And however much sense that might make at a local level, zoom out enough and it sounds awfully like American taxpayers paying $500 million to move 2,000 American jobs from America to America. But the double bottom line here is that even if you consider these things problems, they're really hard to solve. Because even if it doesn't deliver the most efficient outcomes possible, it is possible to argue that this is just the system performing as intended, that this is just a byproduct of democracy being messy. That's what differentiates these sort of incentive issues from another topic we've talked about, which is corruption. Corruption is also really difficult to solve, particularly if it's highly entrenched. But at the very least, you would hope that most people would agree that the government budget being looted to fund mansions and yachts is not the system working as intended. Here, by contrast, things are much less clear-cut. Everyone might agree that they would like a leaner, more efficient military equipped with exactly what it needs for military purposes, purchased with the utmost respect to getting value for money for the taxpayer, just as long as it doesn't threaten the overall health of the defence industrial base or critical jobs that are based in their state or district. That makes reforming to avoid these sort of drawbacks more difficult, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. And so here, if you want to improve things, the first questions to ask are probably based around principle. What factors should legitimately drive defence investment decisions? Who has the power to evaluate those factors? Who has the power to make recommendations and decisions? How should those decisions be reviewed and made transparent? And other questions I'll come back to just a little later on. Because first, what I wanted to do was try and tie all of these abstracts together with a single worked hypothetical. Which means, as you've probably guessed, we're going back to the proud nation of Emutopia. The Emutopian military has fallen on some hard times. Emutopia had invested very heavily in supporting so-called separatists in the South Island of Kiwiland. That effort ultimately came to nothing, and Kiwiland was able to re-secure its territory. Emutopia deeply depleted its reserve of conventional munitions and vehicles supporting that particular effort, and now readiness levels are probably at an all-time low. Some in Emutopia have argued that this proves that the whole effort was a mistake from the start, that the nation should give up on military-driven expansionism and turn instead towards trade, soft power and diplomatic advances. Of course, those cowards were promptly ignored and the government drew up its plans for a grand rearmament campaign. So let's talk about how to rebuild Emutopia's forces up to their former grandeur. As grand as it is, there's only going to be so much money to go around, so what system we put into production is ultimately going to matter. To figure out what they need, the military has done some pretty sober analysis, going over reports of how the conflict played out and trying to figure out what the key priorities should be. They have, for example, identified Kiwi advantages in the areas of effective encrypted communication, distributed and effective fires, cheap and affordable drones, and better distributed short-range air defences and counter-drone systems. This, the officers involved are convinced, is what the military most desperately needs. So the report begins to make its way up the chain, and quite quickly people realise a problem. Most of the stuff the military says it needs isn't built in Emutopia. If we wanted it, we'd either have to buy it in from overseas, which wouldn't create particularly strong local economic benefits, or go through the trouble of trying to set up entirely new production lines. So people clap politely, but they're a little cool on all the boring but useful stuff. Instead, however, as they point out, the army is also very short on tanks. Whether this has anything to do with all the tanks that suddenly appeared in the hands of the Kiwi rebels, who's to say? But surely the army now needs those vehicles replaced, and Emutopia has a powerful and proud domestic tank building sector that's been building armoured vehicles for generations. So what does the Emutopian army really need? Well, step back for a moment and think about it. According to the army, it's all that stuff we talked about before, drones, secure communications, etc. So let's call that one vote, boring stuff. Go talk to the fine folks over in industry policy, however, who are trying to boost the Emutopian economy during this difficult time, and their answer is going to be obvious. The army needs tanks. Ask the employment people who are desperately trying to create jobs for returning veterans, and their answer is going to be the same. The army obviously needs tanks. And then when the topic comes up for discussion in the various political parties in Emutopia, then once again you may get a chorus of approval saying there has never been a better time to up-armour the brave Emutopian military. Now, perhaps some in the army might be a little bit miffed by the way the voting is going. They might bitterly complain, for example, that the closest some of the industry policy people have ever come to operating a tank is always rushing the Scorpion at the beginning of a Halo match. But then again, the incentives on those people are not so much around the quality of the armoured vehicle or the weapon systems themselves, but about the health of the national economy, the national industrial base, and its defence sector. It's not that they don't want the army to have the best equipment possible. And it's not like they're trying to flog off pogo sticks here, they are talking about buying legitimately useful systems. It's just that the balance of individual incentives involved mean that most people here want to buy tanks, not the boring stuff. And so, you guessed it, Emutopia now has a tank program. Okay, so with government now united, a budget line is created and a new project is minted. Industry is informed the army is now looking for a new generation modular multi-mission armoured platform. And the first contracts start going out to enable them to develop some initial designs for further consideration. Even if the nation as a whole might be struggling a bit, the budget here is pretty generous, so you can bet that the firms involved are going to put their best foot forward. And out of all the potentially dozens of concepts that are submitted, ranging from Dave suggesting you just strap some metal sheeting to a Holden Commodore, all the way up to in-production armoured vehicles currently being sold abroad, 2 vehicles, named after some of the most feared and respected Emutopian wildlife, ultimately go into final consideration. Established firm Raider Dynamics has already been selling a tank on the international market for years now. They propose making a few upgrades to the thing, upgrading the armour package, installing new communications, and of course a few additional stubby holders, and bringing into being the RD-24 Bush Turkey. As a program, it would benefit from significant risk reduction, being a mature design, and there'd probably be some cost savings leveraging off an existing supply chain. But rival firm Storm Defence hasn't sold any tanks for a decade or so now, and they really want this win. And so they come at this problem clean slate with the best they can bring. They license in a German diesel, draw up a new, modern, low-profile hull design, work in a couple of fashionable features like an unmanned turret and an optional drone control station, And by the time they're done, the SD-24 bin chicken has been born, a powerful predator for the modern battle space. But while the design phase progresses and the competition continues, both firms have started to get a little nervous. Last year's budget was full of plenty of hype for the tank program and the money was all there. But political priorities in the age of the 24-hour news cycle can sometimes change quickly, and it's important to make sure that the hype and political support remains there in the coming years. And so both firms start thinking about the incentives at play and begin looking at their supply chains in a serious way. Now, if the only thing that mattered was getting the lowest cost per unit possible, you'd probably pick one or a couple of regions that have as much as possible of the things you need. Good access to inputs, good transportation links, and preferably an existing relevant industry. But the problem with concentrating most of your production in one place is that you're really only delivering benefits to the people working in one place. And from a political or economic policy perspective, it may not even be the right one. Maybe the economic policy side of things want to see more of these jobs created in areas that desperately need it, areas with high levels of unemployment, for example. While on the political side, putting all of the production in one seat, for example, might give you one politician who is really, really motivated to make sure this program happens. But at the end of the day, that might only be one vote when it comes to budget time. And so, suddenly, these firms find that there are small businesses in dozens of locations across the breadth of Emutopia, often in very politically significant locations, that will obviously be very welcome to make a valuable contribution to the armoured project. The process might speed up even more when state and local governments start figuring out that they can offer a couple of incentives around the edges to make sure more and more of the activity is concentrated in their relevant area. For those Emutopian West Coasters, putting up some public money to make sure that perhaps the turret, for example, isn't for once built in Eastern Emutopia might be money well spent. Each individual decision slowly chips away at the economic efficiency of the overall project. But from a social, political, maybe even an economic policy perspective, each individual change makes sense and aligns with the incentives involved. The tank program rapidly becomes a truly national one, all but guaranteeing that the budget is safe and the thing can move closer and closer towards production. Which brings us to the final selection phase. The Army ruthlessly puts both vehicles through their paces. They test the physical performance of the vehicle, assess their mechanical reliability, and also measure the survivability of the platform under challenging battlefield conditions. Things like being hit by anti-tank guided missiles, blown up by mines, subjected to extreme climactic conditions, or perhaps most dangerous of all, being left alone with untrained and unsupervised personnel for 15 minutes or more. In the end, the verdict comes back and it's pretty clear. The bush turkey is an absolute winner. Something that makes a certain degree of sense considering the thing was already an international sales success. The vehicle hits and even exceeds all the program performance requirements, is about 37% under the target per unit budget, and the cup holders even include a built-in refrigeration feature. The Army, quite frankly, has fallen in love, and that you might think is that. One vote very clearly goes to the bush turkey. But what about everyone else who gets a vote here? Because even though the bush turkey was a runaway success, the bin chicken wasn't exactly a slouch. Yes, it's a little bit more expensive. No, it doesn't exceed all of the target performance characteristics by quite as much as its opponent does, but it did at least hit all of those required performance parameters. For some of the parties involved, that presents an opportunity. For Radar Dynamics, it's a serious problem. Because here's the thing. The competition provided by Storm Defence can't be taken for granted. It's been a couple of years since they won a major contract, they don't have serious export orders for their existing vehicles, and as a result, their existing infrastructure is underutilised, they've had to shed staff, and they're racking up debt. If they don't win this deal, or something else very soon, it might be time to call curtains on the whole affair. And not only would that seriously devastate some local communities that rely on those facilities for employment, it also might be a threat to the country's defence industry as a whole, because either those facilities are going to end up bought out and merged into Radar Dynamics, in which case there is no longer competition in the Emutopian armoured vehicle market, at least not domestically, or the facility is going to end up mothballed, reducing the overall productive capacity of the defence industrial base, and once again leaving Radar Dynamics as the sole uncontested provider of armoured vehicles. And so, for various reasons, the bin chicken starts to pick up more and more voices speaking in support of it. And so with all these objectives and incentives now clashing, the government decides it's time to negotiate. Now, the negotiations that follow probably put everyone in a bit of a difficult spot. Raider have the better vehicle and they want to see it delivered. But the need to maintain competition speaks pretty clearly in favour of picking the bin chicken. Both designs are backed by significant local political and economic interests. Both could make a valuable contribution to the national economy if appropriately funded. And both are generally compatible with what the Army said it wanted out of a tank. Whatever design is picked, the project is likely to come in under budget. And so in a situation like this, the people involved can go in a variety of different ways. But in this one case, faced by a proverbial Gordian knot, the EMU-topian government decides to take inspiration from the old Soviet Union, back when it was forced to make a decision between vehicles like T-64 and T-72. They take their under-budget program, make it an over-budget program, and issue the announcement, the Army is going to buy both, with the bin chickens and the bush turkeys driving off together at the vanguard of a new EMU-topian armoured force. Now, is this the most cost-effective solution? Obviously not. Is this likely to cause some Army logisticians to reconsider all of the life choices that have led them to the place they now find themselves? Probably so. But the sum total of hundreds of individual choices, each driven by potentially very reasonable incentives and objectives, is that EMUtopia will indeed be fielding a two-type tank fleet, and that little Timmy might have to wait on his next generation school books just that little bit longer, because the mighty bin chickens are going to go to war. Now, all that is obviously deliberately over the top, but hopefully it illustrates the point. Sometimes the natural result of everyone doing their job correctly and acting in line with the incentives that put upon them is that you may not end up with a result that seems perfectly rational in and of itself. And so you might ask the question, what can you potentially do about those sort of situations? And the first thing I'll say is that frankly, it's pretty complicated. This isn't like corruption where the obvious goal is just to stamp it out, because no one in this situation is doing anything illegal, and in most cases you could argue they're just going to be doing their job and acting in line with their incentives. You might be able to change those incentives, but in order to know how to do that, you're first going to have to know what sort of behaviour you're trying to incentivize, which means asking the question first and foremost, what do you want your defence spending to actually do? Is the goal just to buy the best equipment at the lowest cost in the short term? Is the goal to build up and protect domestic industry? Does it have a role, for example, in relation to national employment policy? Or is the answer some combination or all of the above? Whatever those goals and considerations are, they should probably all be brought together into one or more strategy documents or plans. That done, you can put in place incentives and structures to get the results, hopefully, that you want. If, for example, you're trying to ensure the defence budget is as coherent as possible, by doing things like removing the ability of Parliament or Congress to make individual changes to individual line items, then you might adopt a system where the politicians get a thumbs up or thumbs down vote on the entire package rather than being able to make individual edits. But that obviously comes at a cost, because now, for better or worse, there are fewer ways for local representatives to look at a defence budget, see what it means for their constituents, and push for changes that might better benefit them. If you put in place a procurement rule that says lowest bid always wins, well, that's great, you might incentivise some really low bids. But what does it mean, for example, for long-term competition? These sort of decisions can be massively difficult, and they involve trade-offs that often aren't going to be clean and clear-cut. And while there's no doubt a near infinite number of processes or structures you could put in place, none are going to be able to prioritise every interest and concern to the maximum possible extent at the same time. So while the correct answer to a corruption problem is probably always going to be try to get rid of the corruption no matter how difficult it is, when it comes to managing incentives and these kind of interests, there probably isn't a clear-cut answer. And if there is, it's probably not going to fit in a single YouTube video. In conclusion, odd procurement decisions don't always have to be the result of corruption, incompetence, or anything nefarious. Sometimes they're just a result of different objectives, interests, and incentives all mixing together until all kinds of weird and wonderful results come out the other end. The examples I've covered here of trying to maintain competition by preventing consolidation, or looking out for local, state, or national economic and political interests are probably two of the big examples. But they're also far from the only ones. The exact rules and context of defence procurement in different nations is going to vary wildly. But in every case, you're probably going to be dealing with competing interests and incentives. And while a perfect solution is probably never going to be possible, awareness is probably the first step in trying to get that balance right. Okay, brief channel update to close out, and I will make this one brief because I am going to be in transit. We've talked a lot in this channel about the things that can go wrong with defence procurements, particularly focusing on things like corruption, scope creep, etc. And while we will no doubt get back to some of that fun stuff and some true procurement disasters in the future, I have for a long time wanted to spend an episode going into the basics of how procurement can get complicated, even when everyone on paper is doing exactly what they're incentivised and encouraged to do. It may not be as clear-cut, obvious, and arguably hilarious as Sergei Shoigu's allegedly expanding real estate portfolio, but I think it's important to understand that sometimes you can't do a holistic study of something like defence economics without understanding people, their motivations, their incentives, and human behaviour. I hope you've all enjoyed the episode, and we'll be back to Russia and Ukraine next week.